Everyone, and welcome to the 21st meeting of the Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee. This meeting is going to be conducted in a hybrid format with two members, Stuart Stevenson and Richard Lyle, participating remotely. The first item on the agenda is an agriculture and fisheries update, and the committee is taking evidence today from the Cabinet Secretary on agriculture and fisheries matters. And I welcome the panel from the Scottish Government. First of all, the Cabinet Secretary for the Rural Economy and Tourism, Fergus Ewing, George Burgess, the Deputy Director, Food and Drink, Alan Gibb, who I can just see round the corner, the Acting Deputy Director, Sea Fisheries, and John Kerr, the Head of Agricultural Policy Division, Scottish Government. Now, before we go any further, I'd like to go through any declarations of interest that we need to make. The first one is I'd like to say that I am a member of a family farming partnership, as declared on my interests. Peter.
Likewise, Convener, I would like to declare an interest in a farming business in the north east of Scotland as well.
Thank you. And Stuart Stevenson, I think, would like to declare an interest as well. Stuart.
Thank you, Convener. I am the part owner of a very small registered agricultural holding from which I derive no income.
Thank you very much for that. Cabinet Secretary, can I ask you to make a very short opening statement of up to 3 minutes, Cabinet Secretary?
Thank you, Convener. I'm supporting those in our rural economy whom we rely on to put food on the table has never been more important. We are focused now in the recovery phase of the COVID-19 pandemic, but with Brexit on the horizon, they need our support more than ever. For farming, we met our statutory targets and customer commitment to make 95.24% of the value of 219 claims, not only for Pillar 1, but for Pillar 2 payments by the 30th of June, delivering over £500 million to the rural economy, thanks to the excellent work of RPID staff around the country, working largely from home, actually, which is interesting in itself and a positive thing. Despite the unforeseen challenges of delivering under lockdown, that deadline was met at a time of greatest need. We are working closely to implement our climate change plan and ensuring that support helps farmers and crofters to reduce emissions. The launch earlier this week, Convener, of the Sustainable Agricultural Capital Grant Scheme takes another step forward to that aim. We've supported the fisheries sector with over 900 vessels receiving between them £8.3 million through our Sea Fisheries Intervention Funds. The Aquaculture Hardship Fund has made around £635,000 of payments to 40 table-producing shellfish and trout farmers. Our natural larder sits at the heart of the success of our food and drink sector. The current situation is fragile, so we do need to reverse these trends. The recovery plan, including those in the PFG, seeks to bolster and accelerate the core work of the Food and Drink Partnership in delivering Ambition 230 and safeguarding jobs in many rural communities. Our focus is on aiming to stimulate demand for Scottish products in key markets and supporting businesses to capitalise on that demand. On trade, since 18th of October, the US has been imposing tariffs of 25% on single malt Scotch whisky, cheese, butter, cashmere as part of a long-running dispute. This has been a major concern for this government, and we press the UK government at every opportunity to get the removal of these tariffs. The lifting of tariff on sweet biscuits is a relief, but too many businesses continue to be hit hard and jobs and livelihoods are resultantly at risk. We are clear the UK government should use its trade powers to get these destructive tariffs lifted before any agreement is reached in the UK-US trade deal. They can't and shouldn't be used as a bargaining chip. On Brexit, I remain focused on doing all I can to provide stability, certainty, clarity and security for the rural economy amidst the backdrop of a potentially disastrous no-deal Brexit at the end of the transition period. Despite pressing the UK government, there still remain far too many unknowns. A list of 55 questions seeking clarity on the Northern Ireland Protocol was issued to DEFRA by the Scottish Government. We haven't had an answer to those questions as yet. The UK Government's internal market proposals would undermine the high quality and standards that we've set for both food production and animal welfare, apparently for the purpose of allowing the UK to do in different trade deals. There continues to be no progress on fishing negotiations around a future fisheries agreement, and the UK seemingly can't deliver what they promised. We do need clarity and certainty on shares and access now. The annual cycle of routine negotiations setting overall quotas must take place, regardless of any FFA being in place, and my officials are effectively being asked to work with a blindfold on. Perhaps if our offer of participation in the negotiations, convener, had been accepted, more progress might have been made by now. The sheep sector is also vulnerable, with tariffs of 40 to 50% anticipated on exports. I pushed this in a number of IMG meetings. I've written to the Secretary of State highlighting the work done last year should now be revisited, and I'm pleased that George Eustace agreed with that. In conclusion, convener, we continue to call on DEFRA to ensure that they do adhere to the clear, unequivocal, unambiguous promise by Michael Gove that all Brexit costs are met by the UK Treasury. Thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. And the first questions that we have this morning come from Richard Lyle. Richard.
Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. The Scottish Government appointed an advisory group on economic recovery, AGER, in April 2020 to deliver recommendations on the recovery from COVID-19. Can I ask you, overall, what does the advisory group on economic recovery report mean for rural Scotland?
Thank you, Mr. Lyle. The report did highlight many of the challenges that rural Scotland faces, and ones where we're already working to address. And our published response does outline some of the ways in which we seek to do that with a stronger, greener and fairer Scotland. And therefore there are a whole range of actions on housing, on connectivity, on investing in communities, on supporting our farmers and crofters, on delivering support to our forestry and aquaculture sector, and a whole range of activities that we are together seeking to implement to tackle the challenges, the very, very significant challenges facing rural Scotland, not least because of the additional difficulties arising from the troubles facing tourism at the moment and the unemployment that has already generated and may in addition generate.
Thank you for that, Cabinet Secretary. The report stated that the Scottish Government must bring forward clear sector plans to deliver transformational change, where the coincidence of emission reductions, the development of natural capital and job creation is the strongest. Does the Scottish Government intend to bring forward such plans for rural sectors, and what would you anticipate that these would include?
Yes, well, we are working on a whole number of plans, but just let me mention a few specifics. In the programme for government last week, the First Minister announced that we are aiming by an additional investment in forestry to see the planting targets rise by 50% to 18,000 hectares a year. That's a very significant rise by 2024 to 2025. Now, that will help tackle climate change, but it will also boost rural employment. In addition to that, and this was back in April that I did first request this, FLS and Scottish Forestry are doubling the number of people they're taking on. They were planning to take on 25. In the programme from government, they said they're taking on 50. That was at my behest, to invest in young people now. Not wait till next year, but do it now. You know, I'm pleased that modest but significant efforts like that are happening because we are stimulating them. Last week, the £10 million agricultural transformation programme was launched as well. And again, this is intended both to boost employment, to increase the efficiency of our farming, and to help tackle climate change. In addition to that, convener, I'll finish with this because I could go on, if not all day, certainly all morning. But
Cabinet Secretary.
I rather thought you might say that, so I'll be brief as I always seek to be. I'm just going to make the point that, you know, as well as what the government is doing, we work very, very closely with business Just yesterday, I had a session with 4 or 5 major life sciences companies in the Highlands, as well as calls with various people in the forestry sector. You know, I'm asking the private sector to step up to the plate as well, and they want to. They know there's a big crisis coming in unemployment. And I think in Scotland, the private sector want to step up the plate as well. And I'm asking them to. We're not waiting around for the problem to happen. We are tackling it in advance of the serious wave of unemployment that I fear, if the furlough is not extended, will be descending on us quite soon.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. The next questions are from the Deputy Convener, Maureen Watt. Maureen.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. The COVID crisis has obviously had an effect on food supply chains, but it has also had the effect of increased use of local food supplies, and smaller businesses have welcomed that. We are in the middle of food and drink fortnight, so can I ask when and if you intend to publish details of the joint industry recovery plan for the food and drink sector, which hopefully will include a local food strategy, and how do you propose that these ideas are consulted on, and when do you think we'll be able to see it?
Okay, very fair questions, and you know, plainly the backdrop is the food and drink sector has been of increasing importance to the Scottish economy, rising up the ranks of importance in recent years. I've mentioned the US tariffs, which really have had a dreadful impact on the shortbread and whisky sector. Very, very alarming, and it's just a threat that completely is at odds with the so-called special relationship with the UK and the USA, I have to say. And I really do hope it can be resolved by the UK government as a matter of priority. But we are nonetheless working hard with key trade bodies, Scotland Food and Drink, James Withers in particular. We are working in the final stages of a recovery plan. You ask Ms Watt when it will be published. Obviously it will be published fairly shortly and will be widely discussed and consulted upon, and we will be continuing to work in partnership, you know, in areas like in-market specialists that are a sales force for Scotland, in areas like working closely with the major retailers further to boost their sale of local and Scottish produce, and we've had some very constructive engagement, direct engagement there and then, to boost the role of the agricultural sector and agricultural producer organisations in the way in which farmers can direct sell. One of the highlights of COVID, of the response to COVID, I should say, has been the ingenuity of some businesses in marketing online, for example, and direct sales to the public. If that can be stimulated further and developed further, that's a great thing. So I just mentioned some of the component parts that we have seen that we will want to continue to support. The Food for Life programme, a local procurement on the public sector of Scottish food, further boosting that, Convener. These are all key elements of the things that we have been doing and will continue to be supported by us going forward. And at the end of the day, the aim is to safeguard jobs in one of our most important sectors.
Maureen,
That's fine, thank you.
Okay, Oliver, you indicated you want to come in before we go to Emma Harper. Oliver.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. I just was slightly concerned that the picture on tariffs was being presented as if it was some problem between the UK and US. As the Cabinet Secretary, happy to confirm to the committee these were EU-wide tariffs that resulted because of difficulties between the EU and US. And there has already been some welcome progress, for example, on shortbread.
The imposition of these tariffs has been quite disastrous for Scotland's food and drink sector. I mean, in one sense, the cause of it is not relevant. I don't actually...
I would argue it is relevant, so people understand what's happened, because it's one of the examples where being part of the EU doesn't always deliver for Scotland.
Well, I just don't accept that at all. And I would just say this, that if there were this so-called special relationship between the UK and the US, why on earth would the US have unilaterally imposed on a sector that has nothing to do with the dispute in relation to the EU and the US? Why, if that special relationship exists, I just pose the question, Mr Mandel, how come we've got the tariffs?
Oliver, do you want to come back on that?
I'm happy to let that go for now, because I recognise that those tariffs came about as a result of our EU membership. We're a punishment for the behaviour of other companies and other industries within the EU. And I hope, like on shortbread, we will see significant progress now the UK is able to take control of its own trade policy. Okay,
Mike Rumbles, you wanted to come in on that.
Point of clarification. I don't think anybody is happy that tariffs have increased, especially on the Scottish whisky industry. But as I understood it from the Scottish whisky industry, despite the tariff rise, our sales of Scottish whisky have actually gone up in the United States, despite the high rise in tariffs.
Well, I understand that food and drink exports have significantly reduced in the first 5 months of this year, down 500 million pounds. I can get the figures. I mean, the sole point I'm making is that the tariffs are having a disastrous impact on our key exports, and I do question why, if we've got this great relationship with the USA, how that has happened as an incidental to another dispute altogether. I just posed the question, but nobody's answering it today.
Could I just, I'm only interested in accuracy. I'm not making any point here. I just wanted to make sure that when we record this, that we have the actual facts. So it would be very helpful if the Cabinet Secretary could write to the convener with the actual
happy to do that. And, you know, from a fairly recent visit to a distillery in the Highlands, convener, socially distanced, of course, you know, the concern in the whisky sector is palpable, obviously in the single malt sector, and those tend to be the more independent, smaller producers that are producing single malt. So, you know, let us be in no doubt, the impact has been very, very severe. However, Mr. Rumble's point is perfectly fair. We will get what figures we have and share them with the committee to inform your work.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. And the next questions come from Emma Harper. Emma.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, everybody. We had some submissions to the committee which suggest a number of requirements to help support our rural economies and so that they thrive. And affordable housing, public transport, active travel infrastructure, digital infrastructure so that folk can work from home is mentioned. And I know that last week's programme for government it mentions all these items as well. So I'd be interested if the Cabinet Secretary could expand whether what is happening as far as investment with these items so that our rural economies can recover and then continue to thrive.
Cabinet Secretary.
Okay, well, I'll try and be brief, but we have been doing quite a lot in all these areas. In affordable housing, the programme has delivered over 4,800 homes in rural and island areas, including 68 through rural and island housing funds. And on public transport, there's direct annual funding of around 53 million to support bus services, including those in rural and semi-rural, and over 200 million to provide free bus travel for senior citizens and people with a disability. In active travel, we've increased our budget to a record £100.5 million with a commitment of £500 million over the next 5 years. In digital, the R100 programme will make superfast broadband available to every home, and indeed the Scottish Broadband Voucher scheme, which Mr Wheelhouse gave details about on the 18th of August, but which was always a component, as you will well know, convener of the scheme. It provides funding up to £5,000, helping homes and businesses not in scope of R100 or planned commercial investment to obtain superfast broadband. In addition, regional growth deals funds have been committed over the next couple of decades, and I had the pleasure of attending a meeting in Inverness Castle to chair the Inverness Castle Delivery Group on Friday past, social distance again, in order to progress that historic project in my own constituency.
Emma.
Okay, thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I'll move on to my next question, actually. Cabinet Secretary has mentioned skills and education already. I'm interested in exploring that a wee bit. We know that the potential for job creation and skills development is crucial for our rural economy to thrive as well. And you mentioned the furlough scheme earlier, which it would be pretty devastating if we were to lose jobs in Scotland if the furlough scheme wasn't extended. But I'm aware that there are agriculture and rural skills development programmes going on. In one local authority in my region is looking at growing rural talent, for instance. So can you outline, Cabinet Secretary, what the government's plans are then for continuing to do creation of rural jobs, skills development, so that so we don't lose these jobs in the future?
Yeah. Well, you know, I do genuinely fear that if the furlough scheme is not extended, we will see a tsunami of unemployment. And I've had constructive discussions with Nigel Huddleston, the Tourism Minister, about this, because tourism, I think, is really closest to the fire here. There's a huge number of jobs in Scotland supported by the furlough scheme. So this really is a really clear and present danger. That's why we are devoting a cash for jobs and capital for jobs approach with our low carbon fund, our green jobs fund, with our enterprise agencies, with our Green Island Recovery Programme, with our active travel commitments, our investment in skills, and the specifics projects that I mentioned earlier, for example, Scottish Forestry and FLS taking on more young people than they would have done were it not for COVID. So I think this really is a big focus of our effort, Convener, simply because, you know, I do fear that, you know, in my lifetime, I won't have seen anything like this in terms of unemployment. That's what I fear. And I do hope that the furlough scheme will be extended or replaced by some kind of support package from the UK to keep people in employment, not simply the Youth Guarantee, the Kickstart scheme, but a far, far more wide and extensive. Otherwise, in aviation, tourism, and many other areas which have been affected continuously by COVID, I think we do fear a tsunami of unemployment.
Yes, and but before you do, Emma, if I could just say that tourism actually forms out with this committee's responsibilities. It's really agriculture and fisheries. You've mentioned twice, and I notice with a smile you mentioned R100, which I think Paul Wheelhouse had answered the committee on, and is his portfolio, Cabinet Secretary. Sorry, Emma.
Thank you. Thanks, Convener. Just a wee sup, really. You mentioned Scottish Enterprise as one of the key agencies, and Highlands and Islands, obviously. And now there's a South Scotland Enterprise, which will be able to target job creation and support for small and micro businesses, as well as food and drink as well. We know that tourism is directly linked with farming, and agri-tourism has become an issue. So it's hard to sometimes disassociate the tourism with the rural economy. But I'd be interested to hear a wee bit about how the agencies will help support jobs creation and skills development as well.
Yeah, well, all these things affect the rural economy, of course, Convener, but my focus is primarily on my own areas, and therefore, to answer the question, I'm in regular engagement with both the leadership teams at HIE and South of Scotland Enterprise, and with regard to SOSE in Emma Harper's area, this really has hit the ground running since it's a formal establishment in April this year. And we have seen, for example, it play a leading role in the administration both of the Pivotal Enterprise Resilience Fund and the Creative Tourism and Hospitality Enterprises Hardship Fund, bringing over £12 million of funding to 278 businesses across the region. And I think in the course of doing that work, Convener, SOSE has reached out and engaged directly with a large number of businesses, which perhaps it wouldn't necessarily have done pre-COVID. So I think it has got its message across, as I understand it, in the south of Scotland pretty well, and it's focused on a whole range of other support activities right now in doing its job. So I'm very pleased that we set up, the Scottish Government have set up SOSE to meet the particular needs of the south of Scotland, which are so important to us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Emma. The next questions come from John Finney. John.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary and panel. Cabinet Secretary, there's already been reference made to the advisory group in economic recovery, and one of their recommendations, if I can quote, is that the Scottish Government should deploy its expanding tax powers at business support interventions to enable economic recovery. They go on to talk about greater use of conditionality, and indeed they reference the European Commission's approach to that, and the requirement that it would be enforceable criteria and to avoid any unintended consequences in terms of shifting emissions or activity abroad. There have been a number of calls for conditionality and public support to ensure that funding is aligned with wider public objectives. Indeed, this committee has touched on that previously. I note that the Scottish Government implementation plan responds to that recommendation, stating that, and I quote here, broadly accepts the need to align support with our long-term climate, economic, social and environmental goals. I wonder, can you comment on possible changes to funding? And I'll have a supplementary to that. Thank you.
Well, I think the response is correct, that we want to make sure that in providing financial support to stimulate the economy, we do so in a way that is also consistent with our climate change objectives. And that means that we invest very heavily in peatland restoration, in additional forestry, not least actually to try and supplant the situation where Britain is importing a huge proportion of its commercial timber from other countries, with massive carbon costs of transportation across the world. We do need, therefore, to ensure the plantings are of commercial species as well as of non-commercial species for that. And I'm delighted that we've had such success in recent years because of this. I do think the Higgins report was a very useful document in suggesting, for example, that we should look at how we can further improve regulations on renewable energy schemes, for example, citing the example of the McKinnon report back in 2016-17 as an example of good practice, Convener, about how in amending regulation, not to make it looser, but to make it more effective and to allow things to be happening more quickly so that we can see projects going ahead, for example, green projects in renewable energy in the south of Scotland. There's some exciting projects in principle there to be advanced, but the process can mean that it takes a bit long for them to go through all the procedural hoops. So we want to see, yes, conditionality. We also want to see swiftness in things happening so that we're not waiting around for years to see the benefit in terms of green jobs for the economy.
Thank you, Secretary. Now there was four goals that were alluded to there, and you broadly touched on three of them, so that they're climate, economy and environmental goals. What are the social goals, and how would conditionality of public money impact on them? What specifically for rural communities are the social goals, please?
Well, we had this debate, I think, when we set up the SOSE in the legislation, and we debated the need to make sure that in its operation, the new Enterprise and Development Agency worked consistently and in alignment with the Fair Work Convention, the Fair Work Principles, the living wage, for example, being one of them. So we work very closely, and I work very closely with the STUC on that, and Parliament and the government worked to bring forward a framework which is designed, I think, to make sure that those social goals are pursued by the Enterprise Agency in the way that it works. And I think, if my memory serves me correctly, that was reflected in the arrangements that we made for the internal organisation of the agency in mandating this to be done. So I think we can point to that as an example that we are seeking to practice what we preach.
Specifically, Cabinet Secretary, can I ask you about housing? It's a very current debate, and it's pivotal to everything. We all need to live somewhere, and the challenges of rural housing, particularly given the extent of the holiday let sector, and we know the importance of tourism. Can you comment on housing, please, in relation to public money?
Can I comment on housing? Well, I'm delighted that you know, we have, as I mentioned earlier, in response to Emma Harper's question, which I think did invite me to canvass widely on the whole, on the totality of rural issues, that we have enabled the delivery of just short of 5,000 affordable homes, and we continue to need to do that. I mean, it's a complex topic, and it's not actually my direct portfolio.
I was going to say, Cabinet Secretary, so it's slightly out with your portfolio. I wonder if, John, you'd want to phrase that to bring it within the Cabinet Secretary's portfolio, because I'm not sure I understand which way you're going with that question. I'm trying to give you an opportunity here.
Well, thank you very much. There's very much demarcation issues, isn't there, with what this committee can consider. I'm just trying to get where the monies for which the Cabinet Secretary has direct responsibility, how he dovetails the dispersal of these monies connected with wider rural policies, of which clearly housing the population is important.
Well, that's absolutely right, and Mr Finney is correct, and I work very closely with Mr Kevin Stewart and others to pursue these aims, because most of the budget is in his portfolio. But just 2 points. One, you know, we have delivered, and this is largely within my portfolio, the Crofting Grant Scheme, which has seen 1,000 Crofting grants, 1,000 families benefit since this government came to office in 2007. And secondly, you know, I do think there is a role that crofters and farmers can play in providing housing and in enabling the provision of more housing, small settlements, small townships created. I think that would be a great thing if we can enable that. And I'm working closely with Mr Stewart to look at how the planning system might make that an easier proposition in more instances than at the current time, although lots of good work has been done. But I think the farmers and crofters could, if given the permission to do so and the freedom to use their land and holdings to a slightly more wide extent, could actually make a very substantial additional contribution to tackling the housing crisis. And, you know, I think one of the post-COVID effects is that more people may want to live in the rural environment and choose to work using Zoom and Teams and all these methods of meeting people virtually. I think that's only going to exacerbate the housing pressures in rural and island Scotland.
Thank you. Thanks, John. Now, some questions from Colin Smith. Colin.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, panel. There was no mention, Cabinet Secretary, in the programme of government on your proposal to publish a non-statutory statement of policy on food. So can you tell us when you're likely to publish that statement? What do you expect it to include? And how will it align with proposals on a joint industry recovery plan and local food strategy?
Well, the reason there was no reference to it was that I'd announced it the week before. So, you know, it's not the purpose of the First Minister's statement to rehash announcements made by the Rural Economy Secretary, however important they may be. But we are progressing this, as I indicated, and set out to Parliament as quickly as possible. I also announced that I'm chairing a ministerial working group on food, and arrangements are being made for the next meeting of that ministerial working group, where this statement will be an agenda item to be discussed, i.e. a non-statutory statement of policy on food. And I'll be able to provide more details to members after the meeting of the ministerial working group has taken place.
Colin. On the issue of the programme of government, I mean, your programme of government said quite specifically, we will work with the sector to launch our joint recovery plan focused on stimulating demand for Scottish products in key markets, including a new local food strategy for Scotland. With all due respect, that was a previous announcement as well, and that was included in your programme for government. It's just your statement of policy on food commitment wasn't. But can I turn to another related issue? This committee is considering a petition on the human right to food, and Elaine Smith, my colleague, is consulting on a members' bill on the right to food. So could I ask, will the right to food form part of the Scottish Government's consideration on food policy, and can you give us an update on what the Government's view is on a statutory right to food?
Well, as set out in the consultation on the bill, we support the principle of a right to food, but believe that this is best considered by a National Task Force for Human Rights Leadership as part of a single coherent package of legislative proposals. The National Task Force for Human Rights Leadership will be exploring a new statutory human rights framework for Scotland, and it's currently considering the approach it will take to specific rights, convener, including the right to food. And the right to food is an essential part of the overall right to an adequate standard of living. So, as I understand it, the task force, for which I'm not responsible directly, are undertaking an extensive engagement exercise, as is appropriate, with organisations across Scotland to ensure they're fully informed about what these proposals should be and how they will fit into an overall framework. So we are wholly committed to the progressive realisation of all internationally recognised human rights. But these matters, I think, really are best dealt with in a human rights context. And just to conclude, I didn't quite agree with the characterisation Mr. Smith made of the first part of the remarks, but we'll just let that go.
Colin.
It wasn't a characterisation, it was a direct quote from the government's programme of government. But just to be clear, Cabinet Secretary, are you personally in favour of a statutory right to food? Because I think that's really important. I mean, what is your response to the proposal contained both within the petition this committee is considering and the current consultation by Elaine Smith? I mean, either you're in favour of a statutory right to food or you're not. I'm just keen to know what your personal position is.
Well, as the Cabinet Secretary of Rural Economy, I'm in favour of the approach that I set out, that these matters are best considered as a coherent package of legislative proposals in the human rights context.
A statutory right to food within that?
The task force is taking forward this work in the human rights framework, and it's for them to decide how best to proceed. It's not for me to prejudge how that work is done, but I've clearly said that I recognise that including the right to food as an essential part of an overall right to an adequate standard of living is something that we should recognise. So I don't really see what the issue is here, frankly, but there we are.
I did the issue is just a straight yes or no, whether you agree with that legislation should be introduced to commit to the right to food. I mean, I can quote your SNP manifesto in 2019 when you said SNP MSPs will press for the UK to introduce new rights, including a right to food for all and to support resources and action which makes such a right meaningful for people. So I'm just keen to know if you're personally committed to a statutory right to food.
I'm personally committed to the implementation of the Scottish Government's promises, pledges and policies, and I've described quite clearly that there is work in process in order to deliver what Mr. Smith wants. So, you know, I hope he can take that positive response as an answer.
I don't think you're going to get more of an answer than that, Colin. So, if we may, we'll move on to the next questions, which come from Mike Rumbles. Mike.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Quite understandably, in my view, the announcement about the work of the Farming and Food Production Future Policy Group, which was to be made at the Royal Highland Show, as I understand it, in June, didn't happen because of COVID. Obviously, the Royal Highland Show didn't happen. The work, I hope, has continued apace. So I'd like the Cabinet Secretary to confirm that. So could he also tell us when we can expect the group to report its progress, firstly to him, and then when he can make that progress public to us all?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, well, I can inform the committee that the group has met several times to develop broad themes for recommended action, seeking to take a holistic approach to developing the rural economy, sustainable food production, protecting the environment and innovation to deliver all of these things. I think it is fair to say that whilst the emergency caused by COVID has delayed publication, the work will be published this parliamentary term. The scope of the work is very, very broad. The membership of the group, as mandated by Parliament, is very wide. I think they're taking their task extremely seriously. It's a very important task. And you know, I think it's better that these things, in general terms, aren't rushed out. So it's unfortunate that because of COVID, I think this really has put things back a little bit. But I think it's best to allow them time, their own time, to decide when they publish group. I don't want to straitjacket them into a particular timetable today. I don't think that would be fair of me. So I won't do that. What I would emphasise, though, convener, is, as I think every member here knows, we have a very clear plan ahead of stability and simplicity, which takes us to 2024. So there's no vacuum. We have, I think, established to most farmers and crofters very clearly that we want to provide stability, particularly financial stability, up to 2024, and that the remit of the group is post 2024. So, you know, I don't think that there is a huge time pressure us on at the moment. And just the last thing I would say is that, you know, until Brexit becomes clear, some questions cannot be resolved about whether additional support will be needed to support our sheep sector, for example, or whether markets may be lost in Europe to other sectors as well. So, and what about labour, availability of labour, and so on. So, until the Brexit dust settles in some shape or form, I think it is difficult to, out of principle, to come up with proposals as clear as we would like. And also, the shadow of COVID is really hanging over us now, and the effects of COVID on farming are by no means certain yet. I don't want to be alarmist, but you know, in recent weeks we have, convener, seen outbreaks in processing businesses. So we cannot be complacent. And therefore, we are in a time of really unprecedented uncertainty, both COVID and Brexit. And I think it's fair to make the point that, you know, until the dust settles on these things, I'm not sure that people, farmers and crofters, would expect us to come up with a perfect plan for post-24. What I do know is that they're very happy that they've received their farm payments ahead of counterparts elsewhere in the UK, starting on the 1st of September, and now I think in excess of 300 million received by a very large number of farmers. I have the numbers here. I think that financial certainty is perhaps the most important thing for the time being amidst a sea of uncertainty.
Can I just follow that up by saying, really, I'm not expecting, I mean, I understand everything that the Cabinet Secretary just said, but I'm not expecting, haven't been expecting a report to come forward. It was really about a progress report of how the group is working together. This is a group that puts together producers, environmentalists, consumers, all together to try and agree an approach. So I'd like, could the Cabinet Secretary tell us, if he can, in his view, is the group working together well? In order to, is it focusing together well? Is it working together well? Are all the participants from those three sectors agreed that they need to come up with a process which they all can sign up to?
Well, that's a series of questions there. I think they're working cordially and amicably, and I attended virtually their last meeting, but that was the first one I've been able to attend since the Royal Highland Show the previous year. I think Mr Burgess might be able to provide a bit more information if he's permitted, convener.
George.
Certainly, as well as the membership that Mr Rumbles has outlined, there are a number of civil servants within the group to add to it, and I'm one of those. So I think I would agree with the Cabinet Secretary's characterisation that the group is working amicably and constructively. There are, of course, differences of opinion amongst the group, but in all my experience, I've seen those being worked through very well to get to solutions, and work on the report is well advanced.
Can I just ask then, before we move on, is that if the report was due in June, and Cabinet Secretary, you're saying that it will be published hopefully before the end of this session in Parliament, that's 9 months, up to 9 months later. Could you give the committee some idea of when you think it will be published? Because, I mean, a 9-month delay for a report that was started in June 2019 does seem quite lengthy.
Well, I'll come back to the committee as soon as I can. I really don't like to give off-the-cuff commitments, particularly when what I would be doing is committing a group of individuals to kind of complete their work under a deadline. I'm not sure that's particularly fair to them, given the difficulties that COVID has caused for participation. But I am mindful of what the committee has said, and obviously I would like to see the committee reach its conclusions sooner rather than later. But I have set out a couple of important and I think reasonable caveats about COVID and Brexit. And it's, at the end of the day, you know, it's independent of government, this committee. It's not there to do what I or what members wish. It's up to the committee to try to find a consensus. And as Mr Burgess has said, plainly, there are different schools of thought and different views being expressed. So that's a process that I personally think it would be wrong for me to arbitrarily curtail. I don't think that just doesn't feel right to me. But I will come back to the committee as soon as we can, and hopefully, by the middle of October, we might be able to provide a clear prognosis.
Thanks, Cabinet Secretary, for that. Oliver, you wanted to come in.
Thank you, Convener. I'm just slightly confused because during the Stage 3 debate of the Agriculture Bill, the Cabinet Secretary seemed to suggest that that report was imminent. I'm happy to go back and check the wording that was used, but during lengthy exchanges with myself and Colin Smith, there was a suggestion that the report was coming quickly. What's changed since then?
Well, I think the report will be with us relatively soon, certainly before the end of this Parliament. I mean, we're now getting into definitions of what these words mean, but I can't quite remember the exact exchange, but I think I have tried to give a fairly detailed response to Mr Rumble's question. It was Mr Rumble's group, in a sense, because it's his amendment that led to the Scottish Government acting in accordance with the wishes of the Scottish Parliament. And I think I did make the point in the Stage 3 that I was anxious that the Scottish Parliament's will should not be thwarted by a sort of premature attempt to bind this group in the way that the purpose clause that Mr Mandel proposed would, I believe, have done. But fortunately, that was voted down by Parliament. And you'll have to follow that out with the committee, I'm afraid. So I'm going to move on to the next question, which is Peter Chapman. Peter.
Thanks, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, I absolutely don't agree with your statement just recently, sitting there, that there's no urgency to bring forward new plans for agriculture. In fact, I'm amazed about that statement. You know, I need to remind you that the targets for food and drink to double to 30 billion by 2030 are there. There's stringent targets for the rural economy to cut our emissions and to meet green targets that are very stringent, all in place for 2030. And yet you say there's no urgency to do anything before 2024. I don't get that. I mean, that leaves 6 years for this industry to make huge changes. And if I could quote what the NFUS said, they said there is an urgent need for clarity from policymakers if farm businesses are to plan for and begin to implement measures to deliver a green recovery, achieve policy goals and meet ambitious climate change targets within stated timeframes. So there is an urgency, Cabinet Secretary, to get on with this job. And I have continually pushed you over the last number of years, I would argue, to come forward with plans to allow this industry to plan ahead and have some certainty about their future. So I ask again, is the Scottish Government expecting to bring forward additional legislation to underpin new mechanisms of support for agriculture and land use?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, you know, I didn't use the words that Mr Chapman ascribed to me, and I wouldn't have used those words. The point I made is that we have a very clear plan, which I believe has won the confidence of most farmers and crofters that I speak to, of providing stability and certainty for the next 4 years. We're talking about what happens after that, and I just don't agree with the characterisation that somehow we're neglecting these matters. In fact, you know, I have been in contact with the NFUS and a great deal recently, and we work very closely together on a number of things. They welcomed the announcement of capital support for programmes which would increase environmental efficiency. They welcomed that. I've had discussions with them about our proposals to reform greening, which were recently published. They welcomed that. We are working with them right now on important proposals, which I think Mr Chapman would agree are important, about reforming the system of penalties and inspections. And we are working extremely cordially with them. All of these things need to be dealt with right now. In fact, these are, frankly, the priorities for action right now. and we are working with stakeholders to achieve a progress in these matters very swiftly. There is absolutely no lack of a sense of urgency in my part, and I'm absolutely delighted that as at today I can report that ahead of the rest of the UK, 3 months ahead in the case of England, 12,562 farmers and crofters have received between them £312.45 million. I think that's pretty important for farmers and crofters. What happens in 224, yes, it's important, but I think that money in the bank now is probably of more practical importance, in my humble view, Mr. Chapman, than what somebody thinks should be the policy in 2025 onward. So we're getting on with the job right now of looking after our farming crofter community in Scotland, sorting out the IT problems that were a real issue several years ago, fixing those problems, making sure that farmers and crofters can contribute to the rural economy, using that money to pay their bills, to use that money circulating around. These are very, very important things to me. And my honest belief, Convener, is that they are very important to farmers and crofters, who are very practical people and are above all interested in getting things done now. Yes, the future policy is important, and we are mindful of that, and the Farming and Food Production Group will give its advice in due course and relatively soon. But I do think our sense of priorities is one that chimes with the views of most farmers and crofters.
Right, Cabinet Secretary, thank you for that rather long interjection. There are a lot of questions to get through, and you know, I'm trying to make sure the questions are short and the answers are as succinct. So, Peter, do you want to come back on that?
Well, I only to say that obviously the farming community have welcomed the money coming early. That is a given. But the farming community also wants to know what's coming down the track as the support mechanisms going forward. And I don't believe I'm misrepresenting any farmer when I say that. And I do believe, Cabinet Secretary, that this latest group, at least 3 months late now in coming forward with their plans, and you know, you're saying it's sometime in the future that we'll see what they have come up with. I think that's totally and utterly unacceptable, and I will leave it there.
Right, so you've both had a chance to make statements, so I'd remind members it is questions, please, and we'll try and keep the statements out. Oliver, we're on to you now.
Thank you, Convener. We've left the EU. We've got the opportunity to do things differently. Some aspects of CAP, I hope we can now all agree, are not suitable for the future. And indeed, EU-level research has identified issues as well around embedding inequality and social environment and problems meeting social and environmental goals. Can the Cabinet Secretary confirm that we are going to use the powers we've now got to address some of these issues? I know in the Chamber he mentioned the issue of disproportionate penalty regimes as an early area for action. And I'd also myself make a case for restoring LFAS and committing to that up until 2024. So could the Cabinet Secretary set out what he's planning to do with the powers we've got?
Well, first of all, regarding inequality and equality issues generally, I'm very pleased that we set up the Women in Agriculture group and that that group has reported and that action is being taken. So in respect of if the member is referring to this, then obviously the role of women in agriculture has always been key, but more education, access to training has been part of that. I'm not quite sure if the question is referring to that because it was framed at quite a general, but to take the specifics that Mr. Mandel asked about, as far as disproportionate penalties, yes, I've already alluded to the fact that we're working to address that issue. It's a long-standing issue, and we will take action to address that as quickly as we can. Like everything else, it's complex, and that's recognised. And of course, it is important to make sure that we have the highest standards of animal welfare, and that where there's genuine neglect or abuse. In the very small cases that occur, there is appropriate enforcement available, and that is taken. But the overwhelming majority of farmers feel that the current regime is disproportionate in the nature of it, the size of its penalties. In relation to LFAS, I've made it absolutely clear that I do think that direct income support, particularly for those in our hill farmers and extensive holdings and islands, is an essential component. The statistics, convener, show that I think well over a half, and I think up to 2/3 of farms in Scotland would make a loss were it not for the support payments they receive. And I don't think, I never talk about these as subsidies. I think people who refer to them as subsidies are wrong, because farmers are doing things of great value to society, producing food, looking after the countryside, supporting rural communities. These are valuable things for which they get paid. So I do think that direct income support should be, in my view, it is, of course, at the moment, and will continue to be till 2024, a direct component. But it may be, convener, that farmers and crofters will have to farm in a way that reflects the environmental imperatives to a greater extent. And for that reason, we have set up the group led by Jim Walker in order to look at how farmers can increasingly respect the environment, particularly climate change and reduce emissions. And the Walker report is expected fairly imminently in that regard.
Oliver.
Yeah, that was lots of nice words strung together, but not a definite answer on whether or not LFAS would be restored to its previous levels in that time period. I also wonder why, given we can identify areas where CAP can be improved, and agricultural policy can be improved or bettered in Scotland, why we would want to tie ourselves to EU regulations, and why we'd be aiming to keep pace with regulations that no longer are directly relevant to Scottish agriculture. And on a specific point on that, I'd be interested to know, for example, if the EU was to try and ban glyphosate, whether or not the Scottish Government would impose that decision on Scottish farmers.
Well, just taking the funding situation, I think as a matter of fact, it's just important just to remind members that the current UK funding guarantees end in 2020. So the specific guarantees, i.e. those received from the Treasury, end in 2020. So with great respect, convener, anyone asking for total certainty of payments must reflect the fact that we used to be able to rely on the money coming from the EU, but at the moment we don't have the guarantee that the money is going to continue to come from the UK government. Now, they have said in speeches that it's going to come, but that's no use if you're the Finance Secretary. You have to have a guarantee.
If it comes, is that a yes or a no then, Cabinet Secretary? If the money comes, is that a yes?
I'm sorry, yes? I'm being barracked by Mr Mandel now.
Sorry, hold on 2 seconds. Right, let me just make something. First of all, Maureen, I'm convening this meeting, and I will try and keep some order between the members. So it is not helpful when everyone knows around this room I am hard of hearing, that if somebody's talking in my ear, I can't hear it going on. Now, Oliver, you must give the Cabinet Secretary a chance to answer, and I will give you a chance to come back. So please do not walk over each other, especially when we're doing a hybrid meeting. So Cabinet Secretary, very briefly answer the question, and then Oliver, you will come back in.
Well, it is crucial, I think, that the UK government provide clarity, I would say, up to the end of this UK government period, and guarantees now, because farming is a long-term business. So are most rural activities. And I say that, it's not really a political statement. And really, until that clarity is provided, it is simply not possible as a matter of sound government practice to guarantee that money will be spent in specific areas. However, I've absolutely made it clear that it is essential that we continue to provide income support to those farmers who provide incredible value for the money that they get in future, and I believe that that's essential. Whether the scheme is called LFAS or something else doesn't actually matter. What's really important is that that financial support at a reasonable level continues, and that actually is one of the key facets of the work that the Food Group is looking at the moment.
Oliver, you want to come back?
Yeah, I didn't get an answer, Convener, on glyphosate and whether the Scottish Government would ban that if they were keeping pace with the EU, and they did likewise. And on the Belfast point, if the money, as has been stated by the UK Government on numerous occasions, does come, is it the Cabinet Secretary's policy intention to restore Belfast payments to the level, the 100% level?
Okay, well, could I answer directly the questions? First of all, the question is a hypothetical question, if the EU does something. So I can't really be expected to answer hypothetical questions. However, what I would say, Convener, is that I do understand that glyphosate is required as an application, that we all want to move towards less use of treatments and fertilisers, and that's a process that is happening. But it is important that farmers should be able to continue to use the tools that are necessary for the job, and there's an ongoing debate about that, which is quite correct. With regard to Belfast, I've made it absolutely clear that what my intentions are about future. I've made it clear to farmers and crofters themselves at direct meetings all over the country, and I'll continue to do that. I'm very proud that we found winning the Convergence campaign monies a means of maintaining that income for our farmers and crofters. That was a significant victory, and I think the payment last year that we made of 88 million was in part directed towards precisely those farmers who need most support, and that, broadly speaking, will be an approach that we will follow when distributing the remaining funds early next year.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. The next questions will come from Stuart Stevenson, who is remotely attending this meeting. So, Stuart, I now see you on the screen. Your time is up. No, your time is now, sorry.
Thank you very much, Convener. I've just a couple of questions to ask. We welcome the joint working on the UK Fisheries Bill, but we'd be interested to know whether there are updates required in Scotland as well. So perhaps something on that. More significantly, can we have an update on the future of fisheries management national discussion paper and on the shape of inshore modernisation programme that's mentioned in the programme for government? Thank you, Convener.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, the UK Fisheries Bill does provide a legal framework to be used as part of future fisheries management plans. That said, where we need additional legislation to take forward individual policies, we will build this into our approach. So far as the update on the future, the second question that Mr Stevenson asked, the discussion paper was successful in reaching out to many to gather their thoughts and ideas. We will shortly publish an output report alongside our policy response. We will publish also a future fisheries management strategy later this year. That strategy will support delivery of the wider Blue Economy Action Plan and will be focused on delivering sustainable outcomes for our environment, supporting sustainable economic growth within our fishing industry and boosting the resilience of the fisheries sector. And just lastly, the £1.5 million inshore fisheries modernisation programme is progressing well. REM cameras installation on the scallop fleet is underway, having been delayed by the COVID lockdown measures. It's proceeding on a voluntary basis, and in addition, 40 creel vessels participating in the Outer Hebrides inshore fisheries pilot are currently being equipped with a low-cost vessel tracking solution. So you know, these programmes, I think, will make a very substantial contribution to sustainability of fisheries.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Now, Stuart Stevenson has disappeared. I don't know if you've got a follow-up for that, Stuart. You're back.
No, I'm quite content with that, Convener, and I'll let others pick up the baton.
Thank you. Well, actually, I'm going to go to, I know you want to come in, Peter, but I'm going to go to Angus next, because one of the things that the Cabinet Secretary mentioned there, I think, Angus, you wanted to specifically ask on, and then I'll come to you, Peter.
Okay, thank you, Convener. Our sister committee, the Eclair Committee, which I also serve on, has been pursuing the issue of the blue economy for a number of years now. So it's good to see the Blue Economy Action Plan that you've referred to, Cabinet Secretary, in the programme for government. As you've alluded to, the action plan covers marine industries ranging from renewable energy to fisheries and, of course, aquaculture. So I was wondering if you could outline more specifically what will be included in the Blue Economy Action Plan announced in the PFG, including on the intention to improve regulatory processes for aquaculture.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, the Blue Economy Action Plan will be developed across the Scottish Government and the wider public sector, and also, of course, involving marine industries and the environmental interests. So the key elements will be delivering a strategic approach to public sector investment in the marine sphere, facilitating investment, jobs and opportunities in marine industries, and helping to build thriving and vibrant coastal communities to underpin our path towards net zero emissions of greenhouse gases, and showcasing Scotland as a country with great marine resource and a marine science and skill base, looking after our marine assets. Aquaculture was mentioned by Mr MacDonald. This is a key marine industry sector. It makes a valuable economic contribution in every respect, and it will form one of the building blocks of our approach, and there's a great deal of work going on there with regard to harnessing innovation, new technology and skills, whilst continually improving its approach to environmental sustainability. So that will play a key part of the Blue Economy plans.
Angus.
Yeah, thank you. Just following on from that, I mean, obviously there's been regulation in aquaculture that's been temporarily changed during the lockdown. Could you give us an update on where SEPA may be on that, and when we can get back to full regulation as we saw prior to lockdown?
Well, I don't speak for SEPA, but I believe that there were discussions in relation to the operation of fish pens in COVID, with the restrictions that entailed, convener, to allow fish health to be preserved, to allow the continuance of aquaculture, and that temporary arrangements were made to allow that to happen, and that was appreciated. I think these are under review at the moment, as I understand it, but I'm quite sure that Rosanna Cunningham could provide Mr MacDonald with more details of that. I think the aim is to operate as a team to ensure that regulation is effective but not an impediment to sustainable growth. And of course, we have taken a large number of measures, including a sea lice regulation of wrasse, and most recently legislating to cease the treatment of seals, licensing of seals. And there's a lot of work going on in order to further drive forward these standards, both by industry and the environmental side, collaborative work. So I don't think there's any suggestion that regulation was suspended. I think it was amended slightly to reflect the particular circumstances that COVID threw up that really had to be dealt with, particularly to protect fish health and avoid the loss of certain fish stocks, as I understand it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I've got a quick couple of questions on that, but before I do, I'm going to remind members on the committee that I do have an interest in a wild fishery, salmon fishery. Cabinet Secretary, you will have seen the large escapes that have recently occurred on the West Coast, and increased mortality reported by Maui in their fish farms. In fact, quite high levels of mortality, higher than normal levels. Do you have any comment on that?
Well, I'm aware of the incident that referred to. I know that it was quite a large scale. My information is that Mowi reacted very quickly to limit and restrict the impacts which occurred. All of these matters are fully reported in a transparent fashion, and I know that the industry itself is constantly looking to improve frankly, the engineering of fish pens to limit the incidence of escapes, which are, I mean, I'm no expert, but it has been explained to me that they result from a series of specific reasons, some of which are to do with the strength of the nets, for example, which are highly engineered now, particularly in the further offshore pens. So these are matters which I know that the industry takes very seriously indeed, and is quite properly highly regulated and monitored, as this example shows, by the fact that the facts were made public very quickly. I don't know if it's really sensible for me to comment any further on the specific incident, but if the committee wishes more information, then I would endeavour to obtain it for committee members.
I think difficult to round up. I can't remember if it was 50,000 fish that had escaped into the environment. Difficult to round them up once they're out there. You didn't comment specifically then on the increased mortality that was being reported this year, which seems to be initially higher than previous years. Is that of concern to you, Cabinet Secretary?
Well, I would prefer not to comment until I see exactly what I'm being asked to comment on, because these are highly complex matters which are impacted by a range of things. I'm not wanting to duck the question, Convener, but if you give me specific statistics that you would like me to comment on, then I will. But with respect, I think you've referred to a general increase, and I'm just not quite sure if I recognise that. I'm not denying it, but I would prefer not to comment until I see specific facts in front of me. What I can say is that both the Scottish Government, the agencies involved, and the industry are determined to drive up standards, and we are doing that as a whole. And we have indeed some of the high standards in aspects of our regulation in the world. And it's very important from the reputation of our fine Scottish salmon, which has the accolade of Label Rouge, that we continue to make sure that these high standards are applied and be seen to be applied as well.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary, and I will take up the offer to write to you as an individual after this committee meeting on those facts. John, you wanted to come in, and then I'm going to come to you, Peter.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, you'll be aware of considerable ongoing concern about aquaculture. I wonder if you're in a position to, and I appreciate that you may not have all the information at hand, if you're in a position to give the committee an assurance that, for instance, planning guidance will reflect any of the information that comes as a result of this inquiry that may relate to engineering deficiencies relating to that particular incident.
Well, I'm not quite sure I understand precisely what the question is.
Cabinet Secretary, we've heard previously of the government's wish to double production. We've also heard that we'll be led by the evidence. We want to learn to improve, as I understand is the position that you've taken. Accepting that you don't know the fine detail of this particular incident, are you in a position nonetheless to give an assurance to the committee that lessons will be learnt from that incident, including potentially planning advice regarding the engineering matters you alluded to about the security of the fish?
Well, obviously, I would want to make sure that lessons are learned about any major episode, and I'm pretty certain that MOWI will be doing just that. As I say, my understanding is that this may be a matter about the engineering kind of strength of the nets and so on, primarily, rather than a planning issue. If it emerges that there are planning issues, and I'm not aware of any, but if there are, obviously, if Mr. Finney wishes to give me more detailed representations, I undertake to look at them and respond to them directly and comprehensively. But I'm not prejudging, and actually I tend to think it's perhaps not likely that there will be any planning deficiency here. I think it's an industry matter rather than a planning matter, but I'm perhaps going slightly further than I should. But if there is a planning matter, you know, absolutely, if Mr. Finney wants to raise it specific with me, I will make sure that it's properly investigated and considered. And I do accept that some people have concerns about aquaculture, genuine concerns. On the other hand, it does employ people in parts of Scotland where there are no other jobs, with very handsome remuneration, great career opportunities, and we're providing, I think, the lowest carbon form of protein that there is. So, as well as very tasty food. So I think we need to mention the positives as well in this debate.
And Cabinet Secretary, I want to bring back John briefly. And Angus has got a specific point on fish farming, and then I'm going to come to Peter. So, John.
I'm grateful for the Cabinet Secretary for his assurance that these matters will be looked at. For the avoidance of any doubt, when I said a planning matter, I didn't mean in relation to location, although that may be a factor. I meant in relation to structure, because just as we would with housing, we would want to learn if there's a deficiencies in construction. If there are issues to be learnt from the engineering of this site, I hope that that would be reflected in future guidance that's fed through the planning process, so that future.
And I think you've made your statement, and the Cabinet Secretary's sort of acknowledging the principles of that. So, Angus, and then I'm going to come to Peter.
Thank you, Convener. If I could just make a general point and invite the Cabinet Secretary to comment. High tensile cages were being discussed by the industry 8 years ago when the 2012 Aquaculture Bill was going through this place. So, I mean, it's good to know that high standards are being applied, but would you agree that the industry needs to increase the pace with regard to the introduction of stronger cages, and any pressure from the government on that issue would clearly be appreciated?
Cabinet Secretary, briefly, if I may.
I think the industry is well aware of the importance of all these things, and in some respects, aquaculture is a type of engineering industry. Above all, increasingly as it goes further offshore, the nets and cages need to be capable of withstanding the stronger forces that are currents that are found further offshore. So it is a very serious issue, and I know that the industry is very much appraised of this. And there are actually many Scottish onshore companies like Gilforce Marine, headquartered in Inverness, the largest chandlers in Britain, I think, that are very much involved in this engineering side. So there are actually many jobs onshore which are dependent upon the continuing success of the sector. So no fish farm company wants to see escapes. They all want the highest standards here. So I think I can assure the member in that respect, but we will most certainly keep a close watch on these matters.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I'm going to go to Peter Chapman. I think you want to go back to a point and then a couple of other questions.
Yeah. We all know the Brexit negotiations are ongoing, and we will be taking back control of our waters out to 200 miles in less than 4 months, Cabinet Secretary. But we also know that there will be a huge pressure from EU vessels for fishing to continue as usual, as they would see it. So I wonder, have we got the necessary resources, whether it be ships, planes or manpower, to ensure that we can manage the fishery, our fishery, post-Brexit?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, yes, we do. I mean, obviously, the fishermen are very successful at what they do in catching the fish. We have the enforcement team. We have that capacity. You know, I do refer to the UK Fisheries Bill, where we did play a very significant part and work constructively with the UK government to get to a better conclusion than at the beginning. And I'm pleased that we took that approach. I would say I hope that the Scottish Conservatives will support the amendments that are being considered in Westminster very shortly that would see devolution of the sea fish levy to allow us to have more accountability and responsibility for marketing of Scottish sea fish in future. I hope that the Scottish Conservative MPs will support that. I think that would be a further good step. I think overall our disappointment is that the high promises that were made in the referendum haven't been delivered, and the negotiations, which, let's face it, started many months ago, haven't actually achieved anything. So nothing has been delivered at the moment, and there are many concerns in the fishing communities around the coast of Scotland about the possibility of a Brexit no deal, particularly loss of market, loss of freedom of movement, loss of labour, and all of these uncertainties at the moment, Convener, are doing no good at all.
Cabinet Secretary, you mentioned the high promises not being delivered, but you know, I was astounded to hear this week that an SNP delegation to Brussels suggested that the UK government would need to make concessions to get a deal. Do you accept that this is undermining the UK negotiating position, and that it potentially is a means to sell out our fishermen?
Well, I'm not aware of any delegation that did any such thing, so I'm afraid I completely reject that theory. What I would say is that repeatedly, I personally have asked that the UK government allow Alan Gibb here and his team to play a direct part in the negotiations. Most recently, when I met Michael Gove, with whom I have a constructive relationship, I think, and we had a perfectly amicable discussion, and I said, Michael, you know, allow our guys to be their part of the negotiations. He said he would take it away, and I haven't heard anything since. So, you know, and I do think the expertise that Mr. Gibb and his team have, and is evident in their handling of the negotiations that take place not only in Brussels but in Norway and the Faroes every year, is manifest, and it's most unfortunate that the UK government has not allowed us to play a part in the negotiations. Maybe they would have done better had they agreed.
Peter, do you have any other questions?
And we'll leave that, we'll park that there, but what is the current assessment of the health of Scotland's fishing sectors as we emerge from lockdown? I mean, there are many sectors to the fishing industry. It's not all one. It's not one industry. It's several different industries. So, what's the current assessment of the health of the various sectors as we hopefully emerge from lockdown?
Well, there's no doubt that COVID has had a big impact, as the member will know, and especially in the shellfish sector, which hitherto had suffered loss of markets, the brown crab market in China. And to be fair, you know, I've worked with George Eustace on that particular issue fairly constructively. It's a difficult problem, but COVID has exacerbated the problems facing the sector. So there's no doubt about that at all. I think what is really important is that we have a successor to the EMFF, and that the European Maritime Fisheries Fund finance will be available to support the sector in future, and work is being done indeed to develop a range of actions to support the sector and the wider supply chain in the event of a no deal being agreed at the end of 2020. And just on a personal note, I was delighted that I think I'm right in saying that the work to provide compensation for the shellfish sector, and these are mostly smaller businesses, was perfected by Mr. Gibbs' colleagues in Marine Scotland, and they were the first in Britain to receive payments for COVID because of the efficiency of Marine Scotland officials, and also the fact that they have a close knowledge of the sector. That really was what allowed them to act so quickly. It's that they know the sector, they deal with them all the time, and they were therefore able very quickly to identify who needed that financial hardship support in the shellfish sector, which has really had a tough time. So around the coast, the west coast, the islands, I think there's real concern about loss of markets in France and Spain to shellfish in particular, and the loss of freedom of movement means worries about access to labour force in the processing sector, but also the fisheries sector as well. So I'm afraid there's more questions, unresolved answers rather than questions at the moment, Convener.
Just a final one, Cabinet Secretary. I mean, the industry certainly welcomes the support that has been given. Are there any plans that are in place to provide future support, especially if we do end up in a no-deal Brexit situation? Because obviously that will make markets difficult. Is there anything on in the thought process to provide future support?
Well, our support has been geared towards COVID. Any Brexit costs, as I said at the outset, should, in our view, because Brexit is a UK policy, not a Scottish Government policy, be met by the UK Government. And Michael Gove gave a personal assurance that that would be the case in one of the inter-ministerial meetings that I attended some time ago now. So I would expect the UK to meet these costs. One of the costs to aquaculture, for example, will be in environmental health certificates, and the estimate that I recall was that this could lead to up to £15 million a year in additional bureaucracy and certificates as a result of a no deal. that figure is being looked at again. But I think the real worries in fisheries are not only the additional costs and tariffs, incidentally, but also the worry about increased bureaucracy and delays of sending perishable goods to continental Europe as out of the EU, and concerns that that could result in loss of whole lorry loads of consignments through perishable goods being delayed on the route to market, because the timescale of delivery to market is just-in-time arrangement. Every hour is a prisoner. So I think these are the kind of concerns that have taken up quite a lot of my time and my officials' time over the past years in preparing for a no-deal Brexit, and now the no-deal at the end of the transition period. And although some progress has been made, Convener, I don't think these issues have been fully resolved yet, by any means.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Now, one other committee member would like to ask a question, and then I've got a couple of questions at the end, if I may. Emma.
Thank you, Convener. It's probably a quick sup. I mean, we're talking about no-deal Brexit and the issues around that. And, you know, last week we had the debate, and I often raise the issues of standards of food production, standards of food processing. Obviously, we've got really high standards in Scotland and the rest of the UK. And so my concerns is that when I'm hearing about protecting the geographical indication of our whisky, for instance, is that a risk with a no-deal Brexit? Where are we with PGI, for instance? We've also got issues with deregulation of chicken processing in America. Last week I learned about avian leukosis, to do with how chicken is processed too quickly. And so that's a concern for me. So what more can be done to raise the awareness of the consumers about how the standards of food that we have in this country is fantastic? And I know we're not going to make farmers change the way they produce their food, but what more can be done to raise awareness about how the produce is fantastic in Scotland, and how do we protect that?
Well, PGIs are absolutely vital for 13, 14, 15 Scottish products, and they provide a premium to value which is worth a huge amount of money to the sector. So the lack of any clear alternative to PGIs, which are a settled part of the EU, is of concern. But I'll just park that there for the moment. The second part is, how can we increase the awareness of the public of the fact that the standards here are very high? I mean, I hope that there is such an awareness. I think the counterpart question is, how can we make sure the public are aware that some imported foods are not produced to such high standards? And I think there's a genuine fear amongst many farmers that if the high standards that we have to deploy here and they have to comply with at some cost, for example, in the regulation of abattoirs, if we're going to see importation of cheaper meat from some other countries in the world that don't deploy these high standards, that they will be undermined, they will be undercut in the marketplace. And that's a very real worry, I think, for many farmers at the moment. So we did invite Michael Gove to legislate in the trade bill to require that in the case of importation of any food produce, it would need to be demonstrated prior to importation that high standards of equivalent level to those applicable here could be demonstrated. He undertook to do that, but I'm not aware if that promise has been delivered as yet.
Thanks, Emma. Cabinet Secretary, I've got a couple of questions for you, if I may. Could I just confirm that what you said earlier about farmers receiving their payments early in September, I know farmers in Scotland, across Scotland, will welcome that, especially those people who are going to be forced to sit on crops for longer periods of time because the Scottish whisky industry isn't ready to receive them yet. So I do welcome that comment, and I think every farmer in Scotland will welcome it. I just a question on CAP IT. Is it working, the CAP IT system? Is it working correctly? And are all the faults that were identified in the Fisheries report been rectified?
I believe the problems are fixed. the problems are resolved. We are talking about a highly sophisticated system of information technology which has to process over, I think, 1,000 million bits of data. So like any other IT system, convener, it will always require annual maintenance. But the problems that arose back in 15-16, which you and I debated at length, and which used to be a staple part of these discussions, nobody's mentioned it today apart from yourself, but these problems are now fixed. We have kept on the expedient of loan payments, which are, for most purposes, advance payments. There is no interest, I should emphasise that, unless there is overpayment and then late recoupment of the overpayment element, which is a very rare occurrence. So they are advance payments, and we kept that simply because, you know, the financial pressures facing farmers and crofters now in Brexit, and the fact that we can use financial transactions to make these payments, it seemed to me to be an expedient. And I would commend that as part of a future system. I mean, why delay? If you're going to make annual payments, I mean, after all, we get paid every month, don't we? How do farmers get paid? They get paid, you know, occasionally, once a year. Well, the sooner we can make payments, the sooner that money can be used to support the rural economy generally. I hope that these are just, you know, not political, but just common sense elements. But in closing, convener, I'm very happy to assure you that these problems are substantially fixed, and I'm very proud of the work. It's not due to me, it's due to the people that work in the ARPID department, a whole host of people that I had conference calls with every week, more or less in working time for the past 4 years. Every week we had 30 or 60-minute conference call about the minutiae of this to drive that forward. That's a really important work, and I'm very proud of the people that sorted out these problems.
So thank you, Cabinet Secretary, for that. So the CAP IT is working. So in a statement that you made to the committee on the draft budget 18-19, you said that approximately 25% of the budgetary increase for ARPID and SASA pay costs relates to the design and delivery of them and the maintenance of CAP. And then in June this year, you confirmed in a a ministerial statement that there were 385 staff working out of the 17 offices to deliver on the CAP payments. But then in a parliamentary question answered just purely this week, you said there were 441. How many staff are actually required? And if CAP IT is working as it is, are there any cost savings that can be made in the delivery of it?
Well, you've quoted a whole ream of different answers to various questions, and I'm very happy to go away and look at all these. What I would say is that I think we get value for money from our ARPID staff. They perform a great service to around about 19,000 individual businesses, families that are reliant upon the smooth operation of these systems, as well as support for a whole load of Pillar 2 payments as well. The work they do is highly complex. It involves a very substantial number of inspections, for example. So the fact that we have so many staff is in part a component of the fact that, you know, many of these men and women spend their time checking the boundaries of each holding, as you will know, and making sure that the IT digitally records. So there is a need for a substantial number of staff. I mean, is there potential for savings? Well, obviously, if we keep a tight rein on finances, but I would just make the general comment that every complex IT system requires to be maintained and updated. That's something I've learned over the years. In other words, you know, it's not like, you know, operating a child's computer game. This is a different league. It involves a lot of annual maintenance. But if there's a specific way in which you think, convener, that we can improve things, I'm very happy to consider it.
Well, all I'm saying, Cabinet Secretary, is that you accepted there was a 25% increase in costs in running the ARPID system, a lot of which was down to the maintenance of CAP IT, which you now say you fixed, because that was a quote in 18-19. And then you've given me two answers, or you've given the Parliament one answer saying 385 staff work on it, and then you've given me a written answer which says 441 people work on it. Something's wrong somewhere. One of the biggest costs for farmers across Scotland is labour, and when farmers are always looking at reducing labour where it's not required, all I'm asking is, have you got on top of the cap IT you've confirmed you have? Do we need all these staff that you've built up to get on top of it? And how many actually are doing it?
Well, I'm quite happy if you want to share these documents, which weren't shared with me before, although we have answered them, so they're in the public domain. But I'd be very happy to look at any particular issue you have to raise about how we can make savings. The level of staff component fluctuates quite considerably from time to time. There are always a number of vacancies. There are a number of vacancies that are not filled. Obviously, there is a variance in the number of staff required. Also, it has been the case, Convener, that in order to fix the system, there has been additional expenditure on some items, as we've recorded over the, for example, the installation of LIPIS last year involved an additional amount of work. That's just one example. This is a highly complex, dynamic, fluid situation, but overall, as I said earlier, the problems have been substantially fixed. And the important thing, therefore, is that the people that we represent are getting their money, not just on time, but first in Britain.
And Cabinet Secretary, I think that's probably the moment that we've come to the end of this session. So thank you very much, and thank you for your team who attended, but George was, I think, the only one who ended up saying something. So thank you for your contribution in supporting the Cabinet Secretary. I would ask you, Cabinet Secretary, if we could ask you to leave quietly so we can move straight on with the meeting without taking a break, if the committee is happy to do that. And so I'm going to move on to the agenda item 2, which is subordinate legislation. And this is the consideration of one negative instrument as detailed on the agenda. No motions to annul or representations have been received in relation to this instrument. Do any members have any comments on this instrument? I'm not seeing anyone wanting to make any comments. So is the committee agreed that it does not wish to make any recommendation in relation to this instrument? We are agreed, and therefore that concludes today's business. And I'd like to thank those members who are present in person and those people who attended virtually. I see Mr. Lyle on the screen in front of me. Thank you very much, and that concludes today's meeting. Thank you.